they can hold you for 24, 48, however long they deem it necessary to get you evaluated.
Right.
Based off just what your husband
says.
Yeah.
Wow.
So doctors play it safe.
I just think it's funny because he's trying to tell everything.
Just let him
Right.
explain.
So
That's very smart.
Because I'm really the one that did something wrong.
He's been ballistic where we had to leave because he was being awful, and I don't want him to hurt one of the kids or something.
Probably 3 or 4 times that I can remember.
Yeah, 13 years.
Yeah.
Okay. But well, here's the thing: is I don't know, and I'm not going to take sides.
Right, no,
but just talking to you, I mean, I don't see you being a danger to yourself or anybody else. You got your kids to school.
Right.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. So there is a lot of controversy, a lot of argument, a lot of gnashing of teeth, a lot of people confused and uncertain and frustrated because of Laurie's recent evaluation being incompetent to stand trial. Some people feel she's being let off the hook. Others feel that it's just temporary. And so in this episode, we're going to examine both the legal aspect and then also just asking the question, is there something wrong with Laurie? Does she have some kind of mental illness, or, does she not have the ability to choose or appreciate the difference between right and wrong? Does she lack capacity to commit a crime? In other words, is she incompetent? Now, the clip you've just heard comes from the Gilbert Police Department body cam from January the 31st, 2019, and it was as a result of Charles Vallow calling the police and making certain allegations, and then Laurie voluntarily having herself evaluated, and she actually passed, right? And so that is definitely going to come back to haunt her. You already have the contradiction between the court-appointed psychological assessment and then this assessment, right? So you can already see a contradiction there. So let's start from the legal perspective. First of all, it's very interesting that you've got one person in this duo who is considered mentally incompetent while the other one is apparently not. They seem to believe the same thing. They were in a union. They seem to have a meeting of minds. They were unified in their purpose, but now one is incompetent and the other isn't. In any event, what this does is it delays the legal process. It basically means the wheels of justice grind once again to a halt in this pretty slow-moving case, slow-moving as it already is. I've got to say, I think this could have been a tactic from the defense. So on the one hand, you've had almost the prosecution scoring a point, almost scoring a touchdown in releasing this bombshell that there are murder charges, that they basically announced just before the trial was really supposed to happen. They announced these charges against Chad and Laurie. But then what takes the wind out of the sails of the prosecution is that, it doesn't really matter what the charges are, Laurie's incompetent anyway. And then that then becomes the narrative people pay attention to. So I wouldn't be surprised if this isn't a strike by the prosecution, a score by the prosecution, and then a counter strike by the defense to kind of take the wind out of their sails, to sort of take the momentum away. Now, one thing that I think is very dangerous in terms of the prosecution's case is, even if this is later overturned, so in other words, if the state object and if the state demands some kind of additional assessment, right? And that's not out of the question, because we saw exactly the same thing in the Letitia Storr case. We saw her found competent, and then she or her counsel wanted that challenge, and so she was tested again and then once again found competent. And so in this particular case, we may see something similar to that. So on Patreon, there's been a lot of discussion on this. One of my patrons has been saying, so if you embroiled in a cult, does that mean that's just good enough reason that someone could be declared incompetent? You've been caught up in a cult, you've lost your ability to reason, you're not considered insane, but you'll need to be deprogrammed, right? And I find it quite an interesting concept, almost saying, well, the situation with Letitia Stork is completely different with Laurie. Laurie is the victim basically of a cult, right? And so in this scenario, it's kind of like, Chad programmed her or something like that. Chad is the indoctrinated. Chad is the master, the mastermind. And so that makes Laurie the victim. And so Laurie kind of has a back door available to her. I find it quite a scary argument because I think a lot of people would actually believe it. And I also think even if it is overturned, I wouldn't be surprised if, so let's say this is the whole incompetency thing is overturned and Laurie is later found competent and she does stand trial. I wouldn't be surprised if there's some kind of residual thinking on this where the jury themselves, the seed has been planted and the jury themselves start to wonder the same thing. How can you find this person responsible when they were acting in such a bizarre way, right? And it's a very tempting psychology. It's a very tempting path to go down because what you tend to do is say, I don't know how the cult works. I don't know what is going on. I don't know what the dynamics were. I don't know what Laurie was thinking. It doesn't make any sense. Everything was quite crazy. So, because of that, I don't think she really knew what she was doing, so I'm going to let her off the hook. So all the things that normally apply in a true crime case, things like motive, premeditation, evidence, statements, contradictory statements, all those sort of things just fall away because you kind of shrug and you say, you know what, I don't really know what's going on here. I think she got caught up in something and she was programmed. And so the program was running the show. And to me, I know people will say, no, I disagree, it's totally different. But it's a little bit like saying, what Chris Watts, when he fell in love with Nicole Kessinger, it was like a cult. He basically lost his mind. He wasn't in control. He was caught up in kind of a sexual addiction, so he didn't really know what he was doing, so he shouldn't be held responsible. Of course he should. Of course she should. There are a couple of people who have been saying, I think it's going to be hard moving the needle on Laurie's competency because the psychological evaluation was ordered by the court and it was a licensed professional that did it, and they answer to the court, not the defendant. And this particular person writing this said, reports may be challenged by an outside opinion, but most often the court is going to rely most strongly on the initial evaluation provided to the court. Now, my counter argument to that is, okay, so what is the initial evaluation? Isn't the initial evaluation the evaluation they did on January the 31st, 2019, where Laurie herself kind of signed up for it, and she had everything to gain by being found mentally sane or mentally competent or whatever, and so she kind of won that contest. So where does that play into the whole thing?
It's an empty bed.
I can't get in touch with my kids.
How old are your kids?
6.5 and 16.
How long have you been trying?
2 days. But she lost her mind.
Has she made any statements about wanting to hurt the children or anything?
Today she said with Gabe on the phone, come take the kids. I don't care what happens to them. Come take them.
Okay. So what makes her a danger to herself and to others?
She threatened me, murder me, kill me.
She threatened to murder you?
Yes. She thinks she's a resurrected being and a a God. She said, I can murder you.
I can murder you. And she's talking in a spirit.
No, she's talking physically. I will kill you because you're not Charles, and nobody will care.
Okay. So she at this point doesn't think you are her husband?
I'm as bewildered as you are, and I don't know what to do.
Okay.
So someone else has made quite an interesting comment. Again, this is on my Patreon channel, just saying, you know what, guys, I think we're failing to recognize that she's been deemed temporarily incompetent, not insane. And wouldn't this be the interpretation of psychologists meeting with anyone who has left a cult by choice or by force? They deemed incompetent to prevent them from making major life decisions, such as giving all their retirement savings or all of their earthly possessions to a cult. She goes on to say she definitely knows right from wrong, but is being treated much like others seeking psychiatric treatment after leaving a cult. She may genuinely believe she's doing God's work, or she's doing a remarkable job of faking it. With psychotherapy and medication, this would be seen as a temporary condition. Not saying this is a correct evaluation, but it doesn't surprise me that much. And this is where we get into the very murky area where I think a jury could get caught up in this, and it wouldn't take a lot for the defense counsel to sow the seed in the mind of the jury members. And listen to what this particular person says. If Laurie genuinely believed what she was saying and what she was doing, and we don't know whether she genuinely believed that or not, but if she did, she would need cult deprogramming, and this can take some time, as anyone has lost a friend or family member to a cult knows. If she believes she is a god and she was killing zombies, then it stacks up problems down the line if the court just proceeds with a trial without doing a psych evaluation. They are handing her grounds for appeal before they call their first witness. Who wants that? Much better to get this sorted now. The judge knows what he's doing. And also, she goes on to say, the latest evaluation was provided by a court-appointed psychologist, not by her defense team. If the prosecution can't overturn it, then the outcome isn't that she gets to go home not guilty. It is to restore her to competency by deprogramming her, or by meds if she has a schizoid disorder, and saying it's very different from Letitia Stork. I tend to see the whole thing quite differently. I see it, first of all, if Laurie is incompetent, why isn't Chad? Chad, and so maybe you say, well, Chad masterminded everything, he manipulated her, whatever, but you could just as well argue that he also genuinely believed in whatever he believed, that he was somehow radicalized by whatever was out there online. And in a weird way, you could take that psychology and say, oh, well, then anyone is off the hook for sort of losing their track of what reality is. In fact, you could have vast swathes of America, lots of people in other countries as well, that begin to believe in conspiracy theories and whatnot. Oh, they're incompetent to stand trial. Whatever horrible things they did, they can be excused for because they didn't really know what was going on. I'm sorry, but that isn't really how the law works or how reality works. Competency comes down to whether you know the difference between right and wrong, basically, and also whether you are culpable. In other words, whether you had intent. And I think part of how you prove that intent is you say, was there premeditation? Was there planning? And then also, was there an attempt to defeat the ends of justice afterwards and all that kind of thing? And this is the part where I've got a big problem with the whole competency thing, is if Laurie's so incompetent, if her mind is so skewed by these things, then how come she did such a good job of keeping people off her tail for as long as she did? So in other words, if you so mentally ill or just struggling to keep your story straight in your own mind, then how on earth would you be able to, in a credible way, defeat the ends of justice? And we just heard her talking to the police. We've heard her quite a few times. having quite compelling, convincing, credible conversations with people where she sort of discredits other people, right? And it's quite difficult to talk about what we're talking about here in a convincing way, hypothetically, because your mind starts to stray. But what I can tell you is you have exactly the same thing in the Vincent van Gogh case, or the Vincent van Gogh story, which is this guy was mad, and this guy didn't know what he was doing, and he was just really troubled and so on. And that's a very good analogy to this case, where you basically say, okay, so he's mad, he doesn't know what he's doing, he commits suicide and all of those things, right? And then, when I wrote my book, The Murder of Vincent van Gogh, the test was he mad? Was this guy off his rocker, kind of thing? And it was quite simple and easy to establish the truth, which was you just looked at his letters. You looked at how eloquent and logical and sane and sensitive his letters were, how cohesive they were, how coherent they were. Not one letter, not two letters, not three letters, but hundreds of letters, and also lots of letters right up until the day that he died. Besides his letters, it was also his artworks, the fact that he was painting in a way that is cohesive and coherent, that where the art actually holds together, where the colors make sense, the proportions make sense, the perspectives make sense. So you've got this story that on the face of it seems to make sense, but the actual words and the actual art that the artist made make for a far more convincing argument that he was entirely sane, that he knew exactly what he was doing. Was he troubled? Yes. Was he distressed? Yes. But he certainly was also, he had perfect acuity. And I can tell you as a writer, as a kind of an artist myself, from a family of artists, that when you are disturbed, whether you are emotionally distressed or whatever the case, you can't create in a coherent way, because it undermines you, right? It disrupts that whole process. Someone else made the point, just asking kind of rhetorically, I don't understand why she's unfit to stand trial. And the response by someone else was, I don't fully understand it either, but then I remember how sure Charles was that she needed a psych evaluation before he was killed, and how she weaseled out of it, and her son said that she's not right in her mind, right? Now, there's a big difference between that and being incompetent to stand trial. There's a big difference between acting in a way that you personally think is strange and being legally incompetent. There's a huge difference between it. If I go and do the Ironman, which I have actually done, or I go and climb Mount Everest, which I haven't done, or I do this or that, someone else might think, that's crazy, I would never do that. But it's not crazy. It's something that is part of my makeup and part of what I would want to do. You might want to do something like read, let's say, a particular book that's 1,000 pages, and I would say, you're crazy, I'm not really interested in that. People are doing strange things all the time that we disagree with, but it doesn't affect their competency. I've got a neighbor who poisons her garden, because she doesn't like insects sort of at all. Especially she tries to protect her rose bushes, so she laces them with poison, which kills basically everything. It kills the bees. If they're little other insects, beetles or lizards or something, they all get killed. I have a garden that I don't use any insecticides, and it's this little paradise, right? But someone else would say that guy with that garden is nuts. The garden is wild. The garden is unkempt. It's not right. I can actually imagine snakes crawling there in the undergrowth, kind of thing. So one person's logical web is another person's fallacy, but it doesn't impact your competency. So I think if you are trying to understand it, you should think about it from the end result, which is it's an effort to avoid trial. It's an effort to avoid accountability, right? That is what's going on. It's a defense tactic. It's a delaying tactic, right? The other thing is that, and okay, you might say, no, it's not. This was a court-appointed psychologist or whatever. But the fact is, this person found Laurie incompetent, right? And you could say, well, that person was right, that they made the assessment is correct, the assessment is fair, the assessment is valid. But it's also possible that there was some play acting involved, some performance acting involved. We know that Laurie we know when she was first evaluated on the 31st of March, she convinced whoever evaluated her that she was of sound mind. We've seen her on Wheel of Fortune. The whole thing of cults is that they are quite, they get people to believe certain things that are unlikely, like the end of the world and these strange kind of doctrines. And so how hard would it be for someone like that to kind of play act, right? We just don't know. But if she did do that, why would she do it? Well, wouldn't it be, it's a tactic to avoid trial? We saw the same thing with Letitia Stork, who was found competent and then she had herself reevaluated and then she was found competent again, right? So I want to come back to this whole point of, if Laurie genuinely believed X, Y, Z, which we don't know, ... Now, I strongly believe if the defense simply reinforces this point over and over again, they could probably get a jury to acquit on the grounds of reasonable doubt, meaning a jury member might think, I don't really understand how this cult thing works. But I wonder whether Laurie didn't get caught up in it and she's actually an innocent victim here. But that whole assessment would be based on ignorance, right? Personally, and this is just my opinion, it's ludicrous to imagine she didn't know what she was doing when she seemed to know how to lie about it. She seemed to know how to hide what she'd done. She seemed to know how to kind of put things onto Charles, right? She seemed to know how to run away and elude the authorities. She seemed to know how to, and this is, I think, a really important one, she seemed to know how to pull the wool over Kay and Larry, their eyes, where they were deceived, they were misled for quite a long time. And these people weren't sleeping, and just totally unaware what was going on. They were aware and they were trying to find out, and it was still difficult. I can also understand people who perhaps don't understand or can't fathom the cult, saying, okay, I have no idea what's happening. Maybe Laurie didn't either, so she might not necessarily be guilty of anything. But what if she took money from her children to enrich herself? So what? She didn't know what she was doing. And I think an analogy for all of this is the Yorkshire Ripper. And you might think, well, that's really strange. How can they be related? Well, I've been doing a series on my Patreon channel on the Ripper investigation. The Yorkshire Ripper gave a long confession where he confessed to one murder after the other. But at the same time that he's confessing, he sort of tries to create the impression that it's not him who's doing this. He's sort of driven by forces outside of his control. And so at the same time that he's kind of acknowledging what everybody knows, he's misleading them into thinking that actually it wasn't his idea. Actually, he didn't have purpose or motive or the desire or whatever, right? And what is interesting in his defense was that he said, well, he was doing God's work. And he was sort of schizophrenic, but he was doing God's work. And so that was his defense. And to some extent, he succeeded in it because people believed that he was schizophrenic, and they later found out, I think, that his wife had schizophrenia, so he would have known how to act that out or how to convincingly show that. So beyond the legal questions, beyond competency and all of the stuff that we've been talking about, I think the other question arises, which is the simple, straightforward question, is Laurie of sound mind? And there's another video I want to do that's sort of related to this, but it's slightly different, which is, was she dumb to believe in God? It's a slightly different, it's a variation on what we're saying here. But if we take it at face value and say, was Laurie actually nuts? Like, was something wrong with her? And I think as soon as you ask that question, you're kind of conceding that you don't know her very well at all. And we don't. When you ask that question, you're also conceding that you don't know the system, the logical and to some extent fantastical setup that this cult involved in terms of how it was put together, what the reward system was, what the mathematics were of qualifying to be a zombie and all that kind of thing, all the rules and all of that kind of thing. And people who don't know that, who aren't familiar with that, then assume that there's no logic and snap their fingers, and then suddenly the whole thing is, oh, well, I think she was just crazy. It's the easy way of explaining it all, but it's not the right way. You could do the same thing with multi-level marketing and say, you know what, I don't know how all of this works. You know what, I think this person was just, gullible, and, they don't have any responsibility. Of course they do. And of course these systems, which may be fraudulent or bogus, are nevertheless based on certain lines and structures and grids and patterns of economics and pyramids and whatever you want to call it, layers that people can understand. Even though something isn't necessarily legitimate, it's nevertheless a system, and it's a system that to some extent holds together and has kind of a logic of its own. Does that make sense? So where do we go from here? Well, I think there are possibly two possibilities. It would be interesting to hear what some other people, legal experts, say about this, but it could be that there's just a temporary delay, and once Laurie's received restorative treatment, then she will once again be competent, right? So it might just be that. I don't really like that whole line of reasoning at all, and I'll tell you why. I don't like that line of reasoning because it assumes that in the past she wasn't competent. And if you make that case, in other words, if you open that door, you are basically opening the door to the fact that at some point when a crime happened, that she lacked culpability, she lacked the intention. And that, I think, is a questionable legal position to take. And I think once you open that door, you're not going to be able to close it again. As I say, if this applies to Laurie, why wouldn't it apply to Chad? Is he the mastermind? But if he's the mastermind, how come both Laurie and Chad were sort of both guards, and they were both going to, they were both kind of leaders? We know that Laurie was also kind of preaching from the platform of, I think, Preparing a People, that podcast. So I don't know whether you can say Chad indoctrinated her or Chad pulled all the strings and Laurie was just this sort of helpless victim. In terms of the body count in this case, they seem to be equally culpable, certainly in terms of the charges, if they are indeed guilty of something. What is quite ominous in the report the article by KTVB7, and this is quoting from that, Idaho law mandates that a defendant must be able to understand the charges against them, follow what is happening in court, and assist their lawyers in their own defense. Now listen to this. Someone charged with a crime but ruled unfit to stand trial will typically be held in jail, a state-run mental hospital, or an Idaho Department of Correction mental facility where they will receive treatment, medication, and therapy for their mental health issues. Listen to this. If over the course of that treatment, evaluators believe a suspect has regained competency, the case will move forward to trial, even months, years, or decades later. So what may happen next is that the prosecution may oppose the assessment and ask for another assessment, and we'll see what happens from there. I would like to know whether Chad will be tried independently. That will certainly be a strange result if that is what happens. I think the other part that you just can't get away from is it's all fine and well that the post-truth of this case, when it comes time to appear in court and be put on trial, suddenly you are not competent to stand trial. But you've got to ask yourself, when you are selling a cult to other people, aren't you also convincing them of what a competent person you are? When you're appearing on television, Wheel of Fortune, aren't you convincing people of what a competent parent you are? When you are marrying the next person, aren't you doing the same? When the police are knocking on your door and you're able to, and you there is a problem, but you're nevertheless able to convince them of your competency as a parent and as a guardian. And so suddenly you go from being very competent in the eyes of law enforcement. When I say competent, I mean trustworthy, reliable, adequate, all of those things, to where we are now. And it reminds me a little bit of the Oscar Pistorius trial, where 1 minute he's actually a disabled athlete. He doesn't have feet, he doesn't have lower limbs, but he convinces everybody that he's just like everybody else. He's able-bodied, he's just like everyone else, right? And then, but when it comes down to a trial, then suddenly it's all in reverse. Suddenly that hypermasculinity is gone. He's not like everybody else. He's fearful, even though he was this sort of, there was this bravado at the Olympics and the tattoos and the fast cars and the hot girls. Suddenly he's, trembling in his pants, kind of thing. Loud sounds traumatize him. All of this kind of thing, an absolute inversion of it. And there are some people who fall for that kind of thing. I think the defense in the Oscar Pistorius case kind of proved that Oscar, if he was confronted with a dangerous situation, would he fight? Would there be fight or flight? And they were saying, because of his disability, he can't run away. And yet he was an Olympic athlete. His whole job was running. Right? And so the whole way that they inverted that argument was actually quite ludicrous. And this is what they're doing in this particular case. So I think the critical question to ask is, if this whole incompetency thing is temporary, well, how temporary is it? How long is it going to last? And so that is something that we'll, I guess, find out in the fullness of time. So I'm not going to take it further than that. Tomorrow I'm going to be doing a live stream at 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time on the Chris Watts case. We're going to be looking at the commoditization of the case by, to some extent, the Watts family, but also by us. So that's going to be kind of an interesting topic that I don't think other people have spoken about. And then on Sunday, we're going to be discussing the 96 Everest disaster. It's the 25th anniversary of it. It happened 25 years ago this year. And we're going to look at some of the mistakes, the major mistakes made by the leader of the Adventure Consultants expedition, Rob Hall. Last week we looked at Scott Fisher. This week we're looking at Rob Hall. So that should be quite an interesting live stream. Also, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, that is on Sunday. So I'll see you guys then. If you haven't subscribed yet to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment, and I'll see you guys next time.